Apple just announced 2 new iPads, so what do you do? Let's figure it out. Apple's September 14th event had the iPhone and had the Apple Watch. It also had iPads. iPads were debuted. The entry-level iPad and the iPad mini were the 2 new ones to add to an already pretty large iPad lineup. There's the iPad Air from last year and the iPad Pro that Apple announced back in the spring. So let's weigh these out. For a lot of people, I'm going to start right with the entry-level iPad because it's still the one that I feel has the most value and the most performance for most of the stuff that people are looking for their kids. Apple kept the entry-level price for the iPad 9th generation at $329, which lines up with what it was last year. One of the big differences is that there's more storage. So instead of 32 gigabytes, which was way too low, it's now 64. There's also a new processor, an A13, which is not too far back in Apple's chip lineup and is faster than the A12 chip they had on there before. The other thing that's really interesting is that the front-facing camera on this iPad is notably better. There's a 12 megapixel camera, which should provide sharper video and photos, but it also is going to have center stage, which is a feature that showed up on the iPad Pro earlier this year. Have you ever seen what Facebook Portal does, that type of digital zoom in? That's what center stage is. So it's a wide angle camera that also zooms in on people who are in the call. It follows your face. On the iPad Pro, it worked surprisingly well. The iPad camera's placement is still at the top though, so don't expect that everything's going to be perfectly centered with eye contact necessarily, but it should make video calls with families a lot more fun. The rest of this iPad looks pretty similar. There's still a home button on the front, there's still Lightning, there's still a lot of bezel, same screen size, 10.2 inches. But I think that those performance upgrades, that camera, more storage, these are really practical. Except keep in mind, 128 gigabytes of storage, you're going to have to pay up for $479, which is a little bit more than what the 128 cost last year. So now let's get to the Mini. The Mini is an upgrade to the smaller iPad, which was debuted a few years ago. The new one is like a smaller version of the iPad Air that came out last year. So it has a very clean, smaller bezel design, not bezel-less. It has a new processor, A15. It has that center stage camera on the front for zooming in and higher quality. It's got a 12 megapixel camera on the back as well. It's got USB-C, so similar to the iPad Air and the iPad Pro, which is a lot easier for accessories and compatibility with other charge stuff you've got lying around. And it's got better color, wide color gamut, so the display at 8.3 inches looks like it's better. It's also 5G compatible, which is interesting. Now that's going to cost $150 more on top of the $499 entry price. That really ramps up. But for anyone who's kind of a business owner or somebody who's working out in the field, and that's a lot of iPad mini sales around the world, that seems like a very useful feature because it kind of doesn't end around to thinking about an iPad Pro or thinking about an iPhone. So who's the iPad mini for? $500 gets you 64 gigabytes of storage. To get 256 gigabytes of storage, which is the other configuration, you're going to pay $650. Then there's the other compatibility with accessories. Do you buy a smart keyboard? Do you buy a pencil? This is compatible with the 2nd generation pencil, so it snaps on the side, which is a lot more helpful for a small iPad than the 1st gen pencil compatibility before, where you kind of had to find a place to put that pencil. But you have to buy all those things. The price could ramp up really quickly. I didn't even mention that the iPad mini, like the iPad Air, has a side-mounted Touch ID that's built into the home button, which is nice, but it's not Face ID and it's not the same as that big old circular home button thing. In fact, it may be my favorite in between because it's more convenient as far as Touch ID goes versus Face ID, and it takes up less space. But alas, no headphone jack. I still feel like the iPad mini is kind of a pro tool, and I think the entry-level iPad, while it's missing some of those features, feels like a much better bet for a lot of people. And the iPad Pro, well, that's a lot of money. The iPad Pro has an M1 processor, but really it's not changing the equation for how it runs apps. It runs them faster, it runs them more powerfully, but it's still doing the same split screen iPad OS ecosystem thing, which means that if you're expecting it to kind of stand in as an everyday computer, you're still going to have to deal with it being an iPad. And for the iPad Pro's price, I think that leaves it out of the equation for most people. I think the iPad Air is intriguing. The entry-level iPad makes a lot of sense. The iPad mini is interesting, and it depends on how portable you want your iPad to be. If you've been dreaming about having that always connected device that isn't an iPhone but is still an Apple product, it's there. These aren't tremendously exciting developments, but they are improving the iPad lineup, and I think Center Stage showing up on these iPads is a really nice extra perk. So is increasing the base storage on the entry iPad.